All right. It's my pleasure to have on Bad Faith podcast, finally, two actual students, people who have been involved in these really sort of inspiring campus protests that we've seen all across the country. We have Asmer Safi, who is a recent graduate. I don't know if that's right to say, recent graduate of Harvard College, and Prince Williams, who is a rising senior, but as we'll get into, the status of these academic careers are now in flux, given how, frankly, I'll characterize it this way, draconian the administration's pushback has been against pro-Palestinian activism. Welcome to Bad Faith to you both.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, Asmer, how about you start by telling us how you got involved with the pro-Palestinian activism on campus and what the current status of your degree is?
Absolutely. So my name is Asmer. I'm supposed to have had graduated from Harvard as of May 23rd, but have not been given my degree. To take you guys back a little bit, so I've been involved in pro-Palestine organizing not just this year, but since my freshman year of college. So freshman spring, I joined the Palestine Solidarity Committee, which is one of the organizations that is currently facing administrative sanction as well. So it was suspended earlier this year by the Harvard administration based off of new protest rules and regulations that were created in order to make sure that pro-Palestinian activism in some form or way could be stopped. But essentially, I've been part of the divest campaigns that have been calling for divestment from Israel and the crimes of apartheid and genocide on Harvard's campus, and sort of calling attention to Harvard's material and moral complicity in those actions itself. It's scholarly complicity as well. And so that's been sort of like my 4 years. I think this year, particularly post October 7th, obviously we saw a new wave of activism crop up on Harvard's campus that led to the formation of and sort of like a newfound popularity of a lot of groups that were sort of committed to the Palestinian cause as well as scores of people joining Palestinian activism on campus. But also simultaneously, what we saw was a new wave of intimidation, harassment, and doxing that sort of accompanied that to target pro-Palestine activists, but simultaneously also a wave of administrative repression that we've never seen before. Materialize in a fashion that is so much more overt, so much more direct, and so much more severe than we've seen before. And so what that has looked like has been administrative sanction and disciplinary sanction on a lot of individuals, but then simultaneously also sort of ways to suppress this kind of dissent on Harvard's campus. And so what happened with me was that due to my involvement in the encampment itself, I was ad boarded, which is Harvard's sort of language for disciplinary sanction, the week before commencement. And then during the week of commencement, I found out that I've been put on probation until May of 2025, May 17, 2025, which essentially means that I'm a student not in good standing and so will not be able to get my degree until May of 2025, which essentially means that a lot of my postgraduate plans, anything that I was trying to do post leaving Harvard now hangs in limbo. But simultaneously, what this also means is that there is an appeals process that we've been told about that exists to try and appeal the decision. There was a lot of faculty outrage as a consequence of the decision, and we expected that to overturn it. And then the Harvard Corporation kind of steps in and basically is like, these 13 seniors, so it's myself and 13 other people, will not be allowed to graduate despite faculty outrage and despite faculty technically having the leeway to sort of confer degrees and having the mandated jurisdiction to do that. And so what we're now seeing, yeah.
There's a lot there. Just to step back for a second. So some people might be coming to this having seen video of the walkouts that happened at commencement just, a week plus ago, with people listening to this. And they may be aware that while I'm sure there were already plans for protests at graduation, I think the investment of the volume of it, the attention to it was precipitated by or exacerbated by the fact that 13 students, including yourself, had just found out that they were going to be denied the ability to graduate. And you got, in particular, some headlines because you are a Rhodes Scholar, among not the middling student that I was, but someone who has had a really accomplished academic career that sort of, I think, suggests a kind of, norminess, for lack of a better word, that you're someone who was compliant, that can't be stereotyped as what do they say? Someone with a pottery degree who's just there to do activism, all of these kinds of things. I mean, someone who really applied themselves academically and who had gotten so much validation, frankly, from the academic institution, now not being allowed to cross the finish line at the very end because of your involvement in these protests. I want to drill down just a little bit. What did they tell you specifically you were ad boarded for?
So I'm not actually allowed to reveal that because of confidentiality agreements that I have at Harvard based on the disciplinary process itself. But generally, what has come to our attention is just genuine sort of like involvement with the encampment itself. And I think the one thing that faculty themselves are so incredibly pissed about and so angry about is the fact that there's so much vagueness around the charges themselves and so much vagueness around just how these disciplinary sanctions are being talked about, and that there's nothing specific there that sort of implicates individuals. It's just the fact that we were seen or we are sort of participating or involved in with these encampments in general. And I think, you know, speaking not on behalf of the other 13 students, but I think that generally, you know, a lot of us are pretty accomplished and we've, you know, really made the best out of sort of our Harvard experience in terms of academics, in terms of, you know, what we wanted to achieve out of it. But I think also what we've held true to ourselves for the last 4 or 5 years is that these causes are part of our education and are part of the kind of, you know, theory that we've been taught and the kind of things that we take from the classroom. And so I think what it seems like is that the administration wanted to make an example out of these 13 students more than anything else, in that, you know, despite being able to graduate, you can be denied this sort of like last sort of finish line kind of a, you know, piece of paper technically, but that can have great consequences for you. And so I think what we're seeing is that the disproportionateness of the entire situation and sort of the unprecedented ways in which pro-Palestine speech is being sort of censored or, you know, trying to be suppressed is mostly sort of catalyzed by this willingness to, you know, make an example out of individuals. And that's something we've seen across university campuses, not just at Harvard, in ways that has been violent and in ways that has been sort of not even respectful of faculty and staff and other sort of members of the university itself. So that's where the situation lies right now. We're not entirely sure what it will look like going forward. But as it stands, I think plunging us into this sort of limbo of uncertainty is essentially what they want to do to also deter future activists, because a lot of people sort of associate graduation with the ability to do whatever and the ability to actually engage in protest action. So yeah.
And so, Prince, you are a rising senior. Can you speak to what you've been told about why your sort of academic trajectory is in limbo right now? What specifically you have engaged in that has resulted in disciplinary action?
Yeah, so I'm officially suspended by the college. I am a junior, and I'm suspended along with right now 4 other students, but there are other ad board cases in process that can lead to more suspensions. And the trend from the students who have been suspended, as opposed to getting probation or any other disciplinary decision, is that people who have had previous ad board cases, all 5 of us have had a previous ad board case, which were last semester, more Palestine organizing, were given this admonishment ruling, which is basically a warning. Though it is unprecedented for someone to be admonished, given like a slight, you know, tap on the wrist, and then all of a sudden suspended the next time they're in disciplinary process. And, you know, I had written an article for the Crimson a while back about the history of Harvard's suppression of student organizers through what they call the University Statement on Rights and Responsibilities, which is usually what is cited in ad board cases related to left-wing student organizers throughout Harvard's recent history. And that policy stems from the Vietnam War, when Harvard students occupied University Hall in 1969, the Students for a Democratic Society. And at the time, the original Afro group, we recently recreated the Afro organization because we saw a gap in Black political organizing on campus. But since then, that statement of rights and responsibilities has been used. It's vague language, particularly the language of disrupting the normal functions of the university. It's something that is, you know, it's taboo. You can't do, and you can basically fit anything that we do as organizers, as protesters, as activists into the bucket of, you know, disrupting the normal functions of the university. So every ad board case you'll see, from South Africa apartheid from labor organizers in the living wage campaign in the early 2000s, fossil fuel divestment organizers, and just a few years ago, and now us are sided with the same exact policy. And in this case, it's even more ridiculous because they're citing this policy, which is, was created out of a university occupation, and they're saying we engage in an occupation when we're outside in tents in the yard where we rightfully can be as university students. But they know, just as we know, that there's precedent for using this policy against student organizers, and that's what the actual rights and responsibilities has always been used for, and has continued to be used for, to undermine the right to protest and academic freedom, which at the beginning of the document says they uphold.
Yeah, it's incredible to hear the administration ignoring protests about an actual occupation and characterizing the tent encampments as an occupation that warrants censoring students, suspending students. I mean, can you talk a little bit more? I think, Asmer, you alluded to the support that you've received from faculty members and how it was the Harvard Corporation that made the ultimate decision to not allow you to graduate.
Absolutely. So I think, alluding first to what Prince said, I think the one thing that really sort of galvanized faculty and galvanized members of staff was the fact that, you've obviously had this document that, the rights and responsibility document that, was quoted significantly when it came to punishing left-wing activists and radical activists on Harvard's campus. But even within those punishments, there's a level of severity that we have never experienced before, even on Harvard's campus. The sort of, multifold ways in which 70 odd advert cases exist right now, or the fact that people are not being denied the opportunity to graduate, the fact that there's so many people that are now facing suspensions, and sort of like this idea of targeting leaders of particular groups in particular, and like removing them from campus specifically so that they can no longer engage in these protest activities is abhorrent, and it's something that sort of definitely demonstrates the exception to Palestine free speech that we've been seeing in a way that obviously has been latent, obviously has been covert, but this, outwardly has never been experienced before. And so I think the one thing that really sort of pissed faculty off was just the idea that like you are not only sort of suppressing dissent from these individuals, but it sort of goes against the sort of decades-long worth of like precedent and decades-long worth of just proportionateness when it comes to enacting these punishments. And so over 100 faculty members. So there's basically this meeting that happens right before graduation where degrees are conferred. That's held by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. 115 faculty showed up, which again is an unprecedented number to vocalize support for us, and they outvoted any number of attempts to not have our degrees conferred to us, and added our names to the list of students that were supposed to have their degrees conferred to them. However, then it became so that apparently Harvard Corporation really reserves the right to have the buck essentially stops with them when it comes to like deciding who gets those degrees. And so they ultimately ended up intervening. And 2 days after that decision by the faculty, we all received emails saying that despite the faculty vote, you are still not in good standing. And the Harvard Corporation, which essentially is a bunch of rich alumni and business people, have decided to, apprehend you from being able to do this. And so I think definitely that was the moment that sort of galvanized the conversation on Harvard's campus even more. And I think the one thing that we keep saying is the more you repress us, the stronger we sort of push back. And I think the 1,000 people strong walkout and commencement demonstrated that kind of notion, and sort of definitely made it apparent that the exception exists the way in which it does when it comes to Palestine free speech, particularly in academic circumstances and conditions.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the on-campus dynamic and what it feels like for two reasons. One, I think we've heard a lot of coverage about what's been going on at Columbia, specifically the nature of New York and how much media is there, the kind of excessiveness of the police response to the occupation of Hind Hall, all of that. I feel like there's a bit of more of a sense of what the culture of the institution is, and also because Dean Shafiq has been in the center of it and been giving these interviews at the public hearings. And we heard a little bit from her in a way that we haven't necessarily heard as much from Harvard for a while. I am kind of just curious about what the mood of the campus is and how much support you feel from faculty versus how much of the kind of crackdown is coming from Harvard Corporation or other more senior administrators, what the tone was like when classes were still in session, whether this was something that was coming up in the classroom dynamic, what it was like walking across campus and walking through encampments, whether or not there was a diversity of opinion among students or whether there was a pretty strong unanimity, the way the polls seem to suggest that young people are generally broadly supportive. I mean, I am just curious to take a temperature. Maybe Prince, you can weigh in on this.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to the atmosphere pre and during encampment. I know prior to encampment, the campus in a lot of ways, the media very much like blows up the amount of tension that is actually in the air and what's going on. Like if you just paying attention to ruling class media, you're not gonna get an accurate characterization about the actual energy on Harvard's campus. I think there there is, of course, people more on edge about, all sorts of things related to campus protests and just like um, how the administration is responding to us. But ultimately, like there was a lot of sense of normalcy, and sometimes in the wrong ways that like some people were, just about their day and still going to classes and like carrying on their normal lives without really paying no mind to what's actually going on. With the encampment, one brilliant part of the tactic is that you have to confront it. Like you have to, most people have to walk by this encampment or see it or interact with it in some way. And the administration itself had to as well, because we were right in front of the university hall where the dean of the college and many other administrators have to go in and out of every day. And so one of the main issues as organizers, especially on Harvard's campus, that we've had, since dawn and time is the fact that like Harvard's main, strategy is to ignore us. And with the
Mm.
encampment, the administration couldn't ignore us, the student body couldn't ignore us. And we actually, even though the gates of the actual yard were closed, more than ever, we had access to a microphone and like a microscope where like we had the most attention on us we had all year with our organizing. And I think we were better for it, and we were able to magnify our message. We were able to interact with more students and engage in all sorts of political forums. There was interfaith events at the encampment. There was all sorts of guest speakers and students engaging in cultural events, DEPCA and all these cultural foods, like all these things were able to happen through the encampments. And for the most part, the students were impressed. The administration was the one who were hotheads, and they were telling us that we were threats to student safety and we were noise, complaint, and all the
Mm.
rest. When we heard students in the Crimson, first year students who live in the yard say, actually, it's a lot quieter than usual because Harvard constantly is trying to keep up their yard, constantly having people visiting the campus, but now they can't because Harvard closed the yard before we even put up the encampment.
Yeah,
Um,
I was surprised to hear that. I mean, how are they allowing people to get to classes and get to their dorms? Is there like a guard letting people in by showing IDs?
Yeah, so and to this day, right now, the yard is still closed to Harvard ID only. So Securitas, HUPD are, around the yard patrolling basically as a literal visual representation of like an occupied force
Mm.
in Harvard Yard, that is barring all the public outside, Harvard ID holders from coming in and coming out.
Okay. All right. So, and I'm kind of curious. I mean, now it seems like it all happened a million years ago, but how the Claudine Gay saga was experienced on campus, for those who have forgotten, because again, it honestly feels like a lifetime ago that the primary fulcrum of understanding what was going on at college campuses was Claudine Gay going to be able to keep her job or not? But there were mixed views about it, right? Some, there was this feeling like she wasn't exactly defending the students very strongly in the first place, but also that the effort to oust her being led by billionaire Bill Ackman was a bad faith attack. So you felt angry about it, but maybe not so invested because she wasn't necessarily the greatest ally in the world in the first place. She was very new in her tenure, obviously, and her tenure had been celebrated for diversity reasons. I mean, how did students, or I don't expect you to speak for every Harvard student, obviously, but how did you guys sort of experience that drama? And how do you feel about the kind of interim replacement?
I can start. when when Claudine was announced as the next president, there was a issue of the Crimson that came out that was like all the articles were about her,
Mm,
from news to editorial. And I'm on the editorial board, and me and one of my friends, and who's also an organizer, Clive Lawrence, had put out an article that was probably the only critical article in that whole
mm,
issue of the Crimson. That was Harvard needs more than symbolic change from Claudine Gay.
mm.
And it was just like a laundry list of the things that, we're involved in, from labor unions on campus to divestment, to, at the time, Professor Komaroff and his harassment and discrimination case, and the fact that Harvard was keeping him on campus and keeping him teaching classes, all these
Oh, I know
things.
nothing about that. It was he was harassing a student?
Yeah, so there's a professor, he's in anthropology and AFAM, the African American Studies Department, John Komaroff, who has Title IX cases from several grad students,
Mm,
file the Title IX case. And, it was a huge deal. Claudine was, of course, FAS dean at the time, and initially had put sanctions on him, as a professor. He's a tenured professor, so they carry out this investigation. And this investigation, like, he engaged in some sort of harassment and discrimination. Yet he's still a teacher, but our organizing basically like made sure that like nobody enrolled in his class over the last like
mm,
years. We've basically had his classrooms empty, because Harvard won't actually take steps to try to get him, decertified or as a professor there, or try to actually hold him accountable to his actions. So right now he's just resting in empty classrooms.
mm. So there was already kind of an atmosphere, already a feeling that Claudine Gay wasn't being very responsive to the needs of students prior to her coming under fire because of her congressional hearing testimony.
Yeah, I think there, for the most part on campus, there were people who were excited about it for the reasons that you laid out, of diversity, social progress, having a Black woman assume the presidency of Harvard. But for us organizers, I can speak for myself and others around me, there was already skepticism. There was already
Mm,
skepticism there. And fast forward to the Palestine organizing last semester and how she was handling it, we were getting emails, university-wide emails from Claudine Gay saying "From the River to the Sea" is anti-Semitic. Like, things like
mm,
this. It wasn't just her taking a neutral stance or just not defending students. She was actively hostile to
mm,
our message and our organizing. And again, I'm on the editorial board of the Crimson. They do a off the record with the president, every year. And I'm gladly to share some of that off the record. Somebody asked her to her face, "Are we anti-Semitic?" Someone in the Palestine Solidarity Committee said, like, you said these chants or these slogans are anti-Semitic. Like, you're talking about us. You're talking about our movement. You're talking about our organizers. Are we anti-Semitic? And of course, just like in the congressional hearing, which happened a few days before that off the record, she she
mm,
she couldn't answer that directly to us. She couldn't say that. Um, and ultimately, so I'm in an organization called AFRO, the African and African American Resistance Organization. That's only less than a year old. It started in September. And we had put out a statement after Claudine basically got fired, to say that two things can be true. One, from the get-go was a victim of horrendous racist attacks on her, on her intellectual capabilities, on her just as a Black woman, right? In this white supremacist institution, in this space. But at the same time, she got fired because she wasn't Zionist enough. She wouldn't crack down on us. She would say things like "from the river to the sea" is anti-Semitic, and sort of gesture to the Zionist intimidation that we were facing, and trying to basically quell the billionaire punks on Twitter who wanted us, suspended and all these other things. But she wasn't cracking down hard enough on us, and ultimately
Yeah.
that like pushed her to be pushed out.
Yeah.
And both of those things could be true.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the power dynamics here. I mean, I remember, it's funny you mentioned that there was this kind of all Claudine Gay edition of the Crimson. I remember getting a all Claudine Gay edition of, I guess, Harvard Magazine that I hadn't read. I didn't bother reading until she was ousted. And then I was like, all right, I guess it's time to familiarize myself with who this woman really is. And it was kind of an interesting profile, frankly. But I am curious about one of the aspects of the reporting around that incident that I found really interesting, that I think the New York Times did in some follow-up pieces, was the sort of frustration that apparently Bill Ackman had, that she wasn't sufficiently responsive to him, that he was calling and she wasn't picking up the phone, that there was this feeling that a certain donor class at the university should have a direct line and a lot of control over what policies are being set at the university. And when, Asmer, you made reference to the Harvard Corporation big dogging the faculty members, usurping the faculty members' decision to allow you and the 12 others to graduate, it also seems to be speaking to this kind of these tiers of hierarchy and authority that are making these decisions, and how there's this push and pull between people who have some authority, right? University professors, maybe even there's a world where a Claudine Gay was sympathetic to your cause, but there is this feeling that it would not have mattered because the donor class is what seems to be controlling here, which is how I want to get back to this question of the actual divestment that is being demanded. If it is the case that the fundamental demand here is for the Harvard endowment, which is the largest endowment in the history of endowments and larger than the GDPs of like most countries on earth, if the demand is to divest large portions, substantial portions of that endowment from Israel, and we've seen how money seems to be the immovable quantity here, that money talks really, really loudly. I want to know how you're feeling about the progress of the divestment campaign. And maybe if you have experience or knowledge, can you compare it to how previous divestment efforts have gone?
I think so. Again, this is a big question, and I think there's so many different facets with which I can sort of try to answer it. I think the number one thing is I think divestment itself, and that call being so prominent now, specifically on Harvard's campus, is itself a threatening move for a lot of pro-Israel donors, for example, or a lot of individuals that belong to this class, which is vehemently against the kind of politics that we want to foster on Harvard's campus, and politics that has gotten traction in the last couple of months. I think that's number one. I think there's no way to ascertain transparency around the fact that, what lines of communications exist. But we can see semblances of it in how administrators are making their decisions, right? So, for example, the Harvard Corporation being able to just have that entry point after the faculty has said that, the buck stops with us and this is the decision that we want to make. That kind of sort of entry point then randomly coming back into the fore is something that was unprecedented. Or similarly, for example, and I think this particularly speaks to Harvard circumstances and how much sort of public eye was on it last semester. I think, when there was doxing truck that was parading our faces and names on the streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, saying that we were Harvard's leading anti-Semite, and same with other campuses, there were a lot of campuses that were very quick to condemn that truck and said that, regardless of whatever politics, regardless of what you say about these individuals, this kind of intimidation tactic is harrowing and should not be allowed on campus in and of itself. I personally interfaced with President Claudine Gay in October, and I asked her, and this was at Jummah prayers, I'm Muslim, and she came to pay the Muslim community sort of this photo op visit during what were seemingly trying times for us. And essentially, she said that all of their efforts were heroic, but she is in no way entitled to condemn the truck. despite so many of its students of her students being targeted by it. And we all knew that this was accuracy in media. These are foundations that are infamously right wing, and the ways in which they target individuals is particularly callous and problematic. But there was nothing said there, and genuinely, you obviously see sort of like public war that's happening on Twitter, on X, and all sorts of other social media. It sort of again was spearheaded by individuals like Bill Ackman himself, but also money. I think is important to understand in this case is not necessarily an immovable object, right? Because a lot of money has been pulled out of Harvard as a consequence of what the administrators have taken on as decisions themselves. So, for example, Ken Griffin, who was one of these big donors to Harvard, saying that he wants to stop his commitment to be paying Harvard based on sort of anti-Semitism allegations on the campus and the kind of environment that it's fostering. Similarly, with the Wexner Foundation, which used to have a program at the Harvard Kennedy School, pulling out its money very early in October. And so I think that kind of pressure also then puts the administration in this weird sort of interesting light where they now necessarily have to demonstrate to these donors and to this class in particular that they are actually strong-arming us, or they are actually oppressing us in a way that sort of makes the case that actually we are beholden to you, and actually we want to be able to sort of quell your kind of demands and quell the kind of politics and the kind of environment that you want to foster on campus. Because again, regardless of whatever politics people like President Gay sort of foster for themselves and other members of the administrators can, ultimately that does become the object then, which is money, which is finances, which is these things that determines the kind of things and events that happen on campus. So that's number one. I think the other thing that I will say is that as organizers stepping into the encampment, I think Prince can also agree with this. We knew that we wouldn't get divestment overnight. The way in which divestment itself is structured and the way in which the endowment works is that there's so many ambiguities and so much lack of transparency alone that, because, money is managed through hedge funds, you don't know essentially what companies are being invested in. There's only 3% of Harvard's endowment that is actually publicly available. And we want sort of like disclosure and divestment on that front. And so, again, it is a process that we understand as long. But the important thing to consider here as well is that conversations around divestment in the past have definitely been easier to do on Harvard's campus, right? There have been moments where Harvard has divested quite conveniently. I think one of the examples of that is when Harvard divested from Sudan in 2006, right? Because there was only one company that it was primarily invested in, but also it took 400 student petitions to be able to have that entire move be enacted by the Harvard Management Company, whereas something like Israel, it becomes a much bigger political issue of sorts. And so I think what our goal then becomes is to be able to introduce divestment into the campus conversation beyond anything else, and to understand on an individual level that students are complicit just by virtue of being able to pay this university in terms of its tuition. And I think what the encampment achieved was just having that conversation be everywhere, regardless of whether or not you side with it or not. Understanding that is something that is so incredibly crucial to be able to continue a hard conversation, especially when donor pressure, especially when outside pressure, when organizations like ADL are having Anti-Defamation League are having meetings with President Garber the day that we were all getting our suspensions, is insane to us, right? And so it requires first step. Yeah.
Jonathan Greenblatt or somebody else from the ADL was having meetings with the Harvard Corporation days before, around the same time they made the decision not to allow you to graduate?
So not when graduation was not yet on the line. This was when a lot of students were being handed involuntary leave of absences. I think Prince can speak to you more about that. But this was the day that those decisions were coming out. Jonathan Greenblatt, I personally saw him walk outside of out of President Garber's office that morning, and then he famously tweeted about it as well. And so that meeting was happening that very day. And for people that don't know, the Anti-Defamation League, again, is trying to criminalize anti-Zionist speech on campuses and sentiment on campuses, and is also famously xenophobic and racist, right? If that's what matters to you.
What's Garber's deal? What's the new president's approach to all of this?
Should I take it? I can, yeah. I mean, I think Garber's approach is interesting in that his goal was to keep Harvard out of the news as much as possible. And to a certain degree, he succeeded with that for the better part of, the first part of the semester. I think after this sort of outrage that Harvard got as a consequence of Palestine organizing, I think this semester, by enacting a sort of more latent form of suppression, which did not necessarily amount to public emails, but only saying to us that, these are the rights and responsibilities documents. You all now have them in your emails. If you do something when it happens, you will be charged and you will be sanctioned accordingly. And so it was more of like an indirect kind of latent form of suppression that sort of instilled some semblance of a détente on campus of sorts. But at the same time, again, we were still organizing. We were still being sort of, we still had to have, face the disciplinary sanctions and still had to face the kind of repression, suspensions of student organizations as a consequence of the action that we were doing. So Palestine Solidarity Committee, for example, was suspended in April after we were trying to like sort of toe this line between what would get us suspended and what would not get us suspended. And ultimately, based off of like our social media posts and, the organization that we were co-sponsoring with, that was enough grounds for them to basically be able to say that, okay, bye, you're no longer. Yeah.
What social media posts did they decide were beyond the pale?
It was a post for a rally that we co-sponsored with groups such as Afro and Jews for Palestine, which are unrecognized student organizations, and therefore the Palestine Solidarity Committee, the Harvard undergraduate, absolutely, we are unallowed to do that essentially. And so when we did that, and when we wanted to sort of demonstrate that kind of solidarity across the campus, we were immediately penalized for it.
Not to make everything an analogy to Palestine, but the thing where there's like an organization that provides you an authority to do the thing that you want to do, like say, the argument that says Palestine can't evoke, can't try to get justice through the ICC. This is the argument the State Department made. It was a lie, but, can't get jurisdiction via the ICC because it's not a party to the Rome Statute. But who allows Palestine to be a state that can be a party to the Rome Statute? It's the UN. Who keeps blocking the Palestinian recognition as a state in the UN, the United States of America, and round and round and round. This bizarre way that credentializing is a tool to unmoor any movement efforts is really incredible. And it's wild to see it being used on an international stage and on the scale of campus protests. I gotta ask, I can't help. I know this is like the smallest thing and not really that important in the grand scheme of things, but I am a little bit curious about both of your backgrounds. And I mean, we've talked about the external pressure from like the doxing trucks. Obviously, both of you have been, well, Asmer, you said you're going to get your degree just a year from now. And Prince, you're very much up in the air, having been suspended. I mean, what are the conversations with your families like about all of this? And sort of, I'm curious how you came to your politics and whether or not it's partly through your family and if they are kind of understanding and supportive, or if there's, some concern. Obviously, you guys have both worked really, really hard to get where you are and to have accomplished so much. I mean, this is tough and very brave, I want to say. I have a lot of admiration for you both.
Yeah, I can start. I'm in the position where, I'm not by no means the typical Harvard student. Like neither of my parents went to college. I'm going on Harvard's dime. I'm not paying a dime. I'm actually getting a few dollars back.
As well you should be with all that investment, all that endowment money.
Come on.
It's ridiculous that any of us ever had any student debt, but never mind, that's my cross to bear.
And so there's pressure in that aspect, right? Where it's like I'm not a super rich 18th legacy kid. Therefore, I don't have the social capital to be playing around. If I get kicked out, I get kicked out. But ultimately, it's political conviction that has me at the position I am on Palestine anyway. And that political conviction goes way beyond a suspension. It goes beyond, disciplinary action that the university can put on me. And my parents, in that regards, in like conversations with family, my mom's with it. My mom follows all the socials, Hoop, Afro. She's out here on the gram liking all the messages. So she knows what it is. My dad, the only thing he conversation I had with him was basically like, know the consequences, just know what you're doing. And if like right or wrong, I'm going to be with you is what he told me. So I have my parents' blessings and I have strong political convictions. And so once this was hit, and also the type of relationships that you build through this type of work go way beyond a degree. go way beyond any sort of opportunities that you can get through an Ivy League institution. And so all of those, like, I weighed when getting involved and doing this kind of work. And if I never step foot on Harvard's campus again, I'm not going, actually I might get more sleep instead of actually losing any. And I'm gonna be fine. I'm still doing this work. We developed slogans over the last 7 months related to the repression, right? And one of them is, you can suspend us, but you can't suspend the movement. And I might not be a student for the next year, but I will be organizing. I'm going to Washington, D.C. on June 8th, to be the red line, like that. That's way bigger.
Wonderful. Well, I want to see you. I want to make sure that I see you when you're here.
I gotta find transportation, but I plan on getting the
Okay,
bus
we'll talk.
to DC, and meeting a lot of my fellow organizers on campus, and also organizers from all over the country, who I've been in contact with over the last 7 months. So that pales in comparison. This Harvard University degree pales in comparison to all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, I've been reflecting a lot on how sort of apolitical, frankly, my college life felt. I did editorial cartoons for the Crimson, and I look back at them sometimes, and it's so incredibly cringe. There's the kind of superficial politics we were engaged in, and how most of it was about like campus happenings. But like I said, I just have so much admiration for the engagement level that you guys are in, and I really do think. I certainly don't feel like when they say it's you go to the schools like these for connections. I mean, I have friendships, obviously, but I never felt much in the way of like professional connections outside of obviously what the degree stands for in the marketplace, the employment marketplace. But I definitely wish now that I had the closer ties of having worked on something more meaningful than my a cappella group when I was an undergrad. So again, kudos. Asmer, same question to you. I mean, so I just want to make sure I understand this right. So they basically just told you, sure, you can graduate, but just it's going to take a beat. And it's imperiling some of your post-grad plans, I'm sure. But it does feel like a sort of a weird giveaway, like a meager offering to the Bill Ackmans of the world to say, yeah, I promise I suspended these students, but like, don't worry about it. You'll still be able to graduate eventually. I'm just going to ruin your life temporarily for the benefit of the being able to tell donors I can. I mean, how are you looking at this?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, similar to what Prince said, I think, again, the perspective that I've got, I think this experience of participating in activism this year itself has been so emboldening and so empowering in ways that I've never imagined. And that, yes, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty that I'm grappling with now for the year. I was also a student on full financial aid. Now, if I'm not being able to go to, grad school, I'm going to have to find a job. I have to, find ways to support my family. But I think also just like being able to experience all that I did, being able to experience emotionally and just like in terms of camaraderie, the kind of communities that we were able to build just by virtue of being part of this encampment. I mean, one thing that I kept saying is just that everything that the university tries to create in terms of community and in terms of like being able to like foster diversity and inclusion, we did that, and we did that better and more critically in a way that like, has never been seen before on Harvard's campus. And I think that experience was so educational, far more than any degree can be, at least in my opinion. And so I think that, yes, there's obviously more that the future holds for me. I just need to see how it plays out. I think it was really funny to me because my family was there for commencement, and they were there with me at a coffee shop when I got that email from Harvard Corporation, along with another friend of mine who was there with her family as well. And, I obviously was stunned for a second, but it was them that were like, you know what, you're doing this for the right reason. And my family's from Pakistan. I grew up there. I was raised there completely. And so, Palestine obviously is something that remains part of conversations in Pakistan, and the parallels with Palestine are also something that we see on a daily basis unfolding in Pakistan. And so, that sensitivity is something that they were able to tune me to given the circumstances. They're like, you know what, it's gonna be fine. Just have faith and sort of we'll figure things out. And I think just giving myself the perspective that there's so much more that I gained out of this experience. And I pity the administrators that are sanctioning us because, in their attempts to silence us and in their attempts to repress the kind of things that we were trying to do, they lost out on a very valuable opportunity, more than anything else. Something that the faculty was party to, something that the staff of this university was party to, but only the administrators, because of their interests, remained aloof from.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine. Were your parents? Did they have to come from out of the country, or do they live in the States now?
No, so they came from Pakistan all the way. Yeah.
Oh boy. Oh boy, I can't imagine. I mean, they sound like very graceful people and who handled it really beautifully, because I can imagine a different personality type being like, Asmer, what are you doing with your life?
They walked out with
12-hour flight.
They walked out with me. They went to the People's Commencement. They rallied with me. My parents got 50 years. It was beautiful. I think that was, that's what made commencement special for me more than anything else.
Yeah. Well, I did want to mention, we had DM'd a little bit about this, Asmer, that there's this story that is sort of breaking about another level of censorship and repression that we're seeing. It started at Harvard. Now it's gone over to Columbia, started at Harvard Law School specifically. This story, The Intercept, has done some good coverage of it. Prim Tucker, who's been doing just really amazing work covering all of the campus goings on, and Natasha Leonard, who's also a recent guest of the show. The piece is titled Columbia Law Review Refused to Take Down Article on Palestine, so its board of directors new to the whole website. It started out with an article that attempted to, as I understand it, create a kind of legal framework for the Nakba that's akin to the legal framework that defines genocide as a specific crime. The student that wrote that paper initially tried to get it published at Harvard Law School. It was rejected for essentially political reasons. Columbia Law students took it up. It went through the rigorous process of law review. And basically at the 11th hour, in order to prevent students from posting the paper, when they realized there was some pushback that was emerging, the, I guess, administration took the whole law review website down to prevent the public from seeing it. Can you offer some more details here, Asmer?
So absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, Rabia Fadia, who was the author of that article, is not just a student, but he's a prominent legal scholar of Palestine at this point, and works for the Adalah Justice Project. Would be a wonderful person to have on this podcast, and it's been incredibly educational for individuals like myself and Prince, who've been organizing about Palestine. He's from Palestine himself. I think it's interesting to see the layers of repression that has sort of unfolded in this particular case, specifically. So Harvard takes it down. Harvard Law Review takes it down. There's a big controversy around it. Their editors resign on the basis of this article being pulled out. And then sort of Rabia goes on this 5-month spree of sort of, having a follow-up developed to this article in conjunction with editors of the Columbia Law Review. And I think it was posted. I think after it was posted was when the board of directors of the Columbia Law Review were actually absolutely not, threatened to force individuals who were editors to resign on the basis of that article propping up. And I think it's there's more in the Intercept story, and there's more by Prem about the article itself. But I think the one thing that is so incredibly apparent, again, in this case also, is just the ways in which this repression unfolds and the ways in which it's so outwardly unfolding, and the Palestine exception to free speech, but also particularly in scholarship and academia, and how that sort of manifests. And I think here's where things become even more critical, because even outside of the realm of just organizing and activism, this is certainly under the mandate of what the university is supposed to be able to uphold, and the kind of academic scholarship that we want to be able to sort of produce. I think the sort of soft power of academia and the exceptions that exist latently there and sort of become manifest when certain concepts are now being introduced, or language to be able to describe the specificity of the Palestinian case is now being is becoming manifest. I think that's where we begin to sort of problematize the kind of ways in which these academic circles work, and then also how they too are sort of beholden to powers that be that lie way above them and can sort of make these decisions sort of impromptu, despite 5 months of effort going into this piece that was obviously solicited by the Columbia Law Review itself. And so, what Rabia's case is demonstrating again is just, the sort of attack on academic freedom. But it's also very, very important to state is that solidarity with what's happening in Palestine cannot just be based on through the lens of academic freedom and through what's happening in these universities. I think one thing that we saw a lot at the commencement itself and the amount of people that walked out, 1,500 of them, is our degrees should not be the catalyzing force, or when an article being rejected should not be the catalyzing force for why people sort of associate with the cause. And I think while the pushback is important, while the pushback needs to be profound and it needs to be sort of impactful in terms of reversing these things, I think these are the same individuals, or Rabia himself, who's been calling attention to this genocide and to the ways in which it's unfolding. And I think that should be the focus of our attention at any given point, but also the ways in which that discussion is exceptionalized on campuses and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, it's so it's difficult for the same reasons. When I was talking about the parallels between the kind of international law dance about who gets to have jurisdiction, who gets to avail themselves of the protection of international law, and how the rules around who is an official organization that gets to have a protest on campus and all of the gatekeeping that can happen there. It's a double-edged sword, right? Because I'm grateful that there are some international law frameworks that we can use to make the case for why Palestinians deserve to have basic rights, freedoms, and protections. At the same time, the laws themselves, who they apply to, how they're designed, how they're written, has all these biases baked in and have mechanisms that prevent people being able to avail themselves of it equally, whether it's through the veto power of the United States and the UN or some of these other kinds of mechanisms. And so it's fascinating to see kind of on the micro level here with the battle around this paper and think about how many other similar battles like this have happened in the past. Why is it that we don't have a framework for talking about something like the Nakba already, the way that we're able to use genocide and the legal framework around genocide to try to make the case for why what Israel is doing in Gaza is so unconscionable? Well, now we're in the space where we're trying to, define genocide, and we have this whole debate around genocide, but can you imagine a different kind of world where, because papers like this one weren't thwarted, because there weren't kind of personal and professional risks to pursuing this kind of academic research, that there might already be a framework in effect that could much more easily, frankly, explain to the world and create accountability mechanisms for Palestinians because of what had already happened back in 1948. That's all to say. I mean, I take your point about keeping perspective around all of this, but it is easy. It is interesting to see at how many layers kind of equality and justice is thwarted here. Before we wrap, I did have a little bit of a maybe messy question for you, Prince, because I am curious about the innovation of the group Afro. I'm interested in the kind of disproportionate engagement that Black students all around the country have had in showing solidarity with Palestine. And I'm curious about what the culture among Black students is like at Harvard, because at least back in my day, there was a little bit of a libbish air to the politics, in the way that I think people who see themselves as, and accurately describe themselves as being kind of new to a certain kind of opportunity, sometimes are a little less risk-taking, can be a little bit more kind of socially and personally conservative. And I'm curious about whether or not the innovation of a new group had to do with some the politics of the Black students, not BALSA, sorry, I'm back in law school time, the BSA, or any of the other Black student undergrad student organizations, or whether or not it simply was born out of a need for something completely different without it being a kind of a referendum on a more conservative politics that I witnessed back in my day in some of those organizations.
Yeah, the latter is correct. So we had, I've been organizing in all sorts of different capacities since I've came to Harvard. First, I got involved with labor, with the student labor action movement. Slam, which has different iterations of the group over Harvard's history. And then getting more involved with divestment groups, so prison divestment campaign and the Palestine Solidarity Committee. And what I noticed, like being in different spaces, divestment, mutual aid, labor, there wasn't a lot of Black students on campus who any of these spaces. And it was like, every year we would, Slam would recruit one new Black person, and it would be hype, like, let's go, we got another one. And it was like, man, where are Black students like in these struggles for a union contract or a divestment? And so last year, April of last year, there was a swatting on campus in one of the undergraduate dorms in Lever House, where there was a false 911 call that basically said that there was some students being held hostage in a suite that had 4 Black students in it. So HUPD raided the suite, and that created, there was several town halls from Black students on campus to talk about this. The fact that the administration was very slow to respond, to communicate to us what happened, all the rest. And ultimately, in those conversations, myself and others who had been in the organizing spaces were voicing, a lot of the conversations in the room were bringing back up things that Black students have wanted on campus for quite a while. They keep falling out of the consciousness because there's no central political vehicle for Black students at Harvard. So whether it be like getting, cops off campus or disarming HUPD, mental health services are like infamously terrible, especially to Black students on Harvard's campus. The Multicultural Center is something people have been talking about for years and years. And so like all these things started coming up, and several of us identified that a lot of these things could be more achievable, could be advocated for if there was a political vehicle for Black students on campus. And so, this past fall, we, started Afro in part because we believe that one, historically, Black students and Black people have been the catalyst for all social movements in the United States. And there is no different, in our current context, like Black people are essential in modern social movements. And so we wanted that we did it for that aspect, but also for the fact that on Harvard's campus in particular, there was a depoliticization of not just, Black affinity orgs, but all affinity orgs. And so trying to, kickstart a movement of people on campuses that saw their identities in a very political way, and confronting that and using that and using, creating a vehicle for themselves to, get involved in these politics. And so we had a meeting the other day, our first meeting of the summer. We had 25 people in that meeting in the summer, 25 Blacks at Harvard who talk about Palestine, who talk about affirmative action, who organize around these issues. And it only is possible because we have this political vehicle at this point, right? We found that there was a good chunk of people who wanted to get involved with these issues, but didn't have the space for it. And now Afro's here, and like we have a good group that can organize around these big things that we care about.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. Look, no shade to the other organizations. Certainly, I was just mostly going there to look at boys. But I'm really glad. I'm really glad there's a more substantive organization that's around these days, because I do think that there was a kind of an untapped political appetite, but so much of the organizing around the Black stuff was about kind of social events and more kind of domestic, I guess, politics stuff on campus. So kudos to you for organizing that. And thank you to both of you for spending the time with me today to talk about what's going on campus. I salute you both and everybody else who's been working with you for your courage and your willingness to kind of self-sacrifice and put the needs of a movement above kind of these, legitimate and meaningful but personal concerns. And you're really an inspiration. Thank you so much. Thank you. And please do check back in if there's any updates, and maybe I'll see you in a week or so, Prince. a few days.
Yeah, no, for real. We appreciate you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah,
Can you let the public know where they can find you on the internet and tune in to any other work you may be working on?
Yeah, I'm pretty ghost, but please follow at Harv Afro. It's not Harvard because they don't let us use the Harvard name. But ARV Afro. Follow us. Follow Hoop, the Harvard Out of Occupied Palestine Coalition, for updates about, Palestine organizing, the coalition work that me and Esmer, work on every day and are doing, on campus and off campus. And yeah, that the organizing Instagrams are the only ones I'm on.
Yeah, I'll plug in my personal ones too, but definitely priority to those. But I'm Asmer Safi on Twitter and Instagram. And yeah, if you want to learn more about Pakistani politics too, you'll find me there.
Awesome. Terrific. Thank you to you both. Thank you all for listening to Bad Faith. If you want an extra episode of Bad Faith every week, you can go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the show. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.